In many ways, Hermeticism is just at the core of Western esotericism. That is, the notion of an ancient, truly primordial wisdom which promises human salvation, perfect knowledge of the cosmos, and the ability to transform being itself, as taught by the ancient sage Hermes Trismegistus, the Egyptian thrice great Thoth. The so-called philosophical Hermetica is just such a promise of spiritual rebirth through reverence, auto-exorcism, and the transition from the material world to the purely spiritual world of true reality, the divine light. And in combination with these spiritual technologies of the self, the so-called technical Hermetica promise a true understanding of the structure and transformation of the cosmos, of the physical world around us through the occult sciences, specifically of astrology, of alchemy, and of magic or theurgy. Given such, the Hermetica has inspired technical, philosophical, and spiritual innovation for millennia. But the origins of this Hermetic matrix remain pretty mysterious to us. We're only just now getting a concrete sense of the historical, material, and ideological conditions which actually gave rise to the Hermetica in the first place. But on my recent trip to Egypt, it inspired me to go down a rabbit hole of potential vectors on the origins of Hermeticism itself, both the philosophical and the technical Hermetica. And this is found in the person of Petosiris, a 4th century BCE high priest of Thoth. Indeed, his tomb, an ancient site of pilgrimage, may be a clue into the origins of the world that gave us Hermeticism, but also the development of Petosiris as a character who, in the Roman period, would become deeply associated with elements of the technical Hermetica, especially astrology. What might this historical person and the high priest of Thoth, the writings on the walls of his tomb, and his becoming associated with the occult sciences tell us about the origins of Hermeticism? Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support work like this of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content here on YouTube, I'd encourage you, hopefully you'll check out my Patreon or take a look at some of the merch that we offer here on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you just want to get the lay of the land, check out my study guide for a curated introduction to the world of Western esotericism. And if you're very hardcore and you actually want to own some historical books on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out my bookstore over at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links pinned in the description and in the comments below. But now, let's explore the person Petosiris, the historical high priest of Thoth and the legendary astrologer, perhaps at the origins of Hermeticism itself. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Before I get started, I just want to say a deep and profound thank you to everyone at Argos Destinations for having made the trip to Egypt possible. Aubrey, you are just an amazing woman, an amazing leader, and I'm so grateful for all the work you and your team did to make our journey to Egypt successful. I could never make this content without the hard work that went in to making the trip to Egypt possible. Folks, if you're interested in unique travel destinations in places like Egypt, you want to plan a trip, I would highly recommend you contact Argos. Such a degree of professionalism like I've never seen. Really, just everything was done with such care and so seamless that I have to admit I was very, very impressed. So Aubrey, folks at Argos, thank you so much. And for anyone interested in checking out Argos Destinations and the trips they offer, I'm going to put a link in the description. Please check them out and let them know that I sent you. But now let's turn to Petosiris, someone who, in some ways, I've only recently discovered precisely because of this recent trip to Egypt. As many of you know, I was recently in Egypt leading a series of tours and seminars exploring what I call technologies of ascent. That is, schools of spiritual ascent that all share in common having their birthplace in the land of Egypt. From the origins of the afterlife, the very concept of the soul itself, Middle and Neoplatonism, the schools of Gnosticism, Greco-Egyptian magic, even Lurianic Kabbalah was born along the shores of the Nile before being revealed to the world at Safed over in Palestine. Egypt is simply the birthplace of Western esotericism, and this is no more apparent than in the Egyptian birth and development of Hermeticism, perhaps the most foundational of all the Western mystery schools. Of course, I came to Egypt as a teacher, but one is only as good as a teacher as one can instantly become a student. And that was never more immediately obvious to me in the time that it took for me to become instantly a student when I entered the Tomb of Petosiris in the Middle Egyptian Governorate of Minya. As I mentioned in the introduction, the question of the origins of Hermeticism remain opaque, to say the very least. The Corpus Hermeticum as we have it dates to the first few centuries of the Common Era, well into the Roman period. However, recent scholarship has shown that beneath the veneer of the technical language of Middle Platonism is in fact a system of salvific wisdom traditions that likely have its origins in the Egyptian priesthood. One of the many outstanding questions in the study of Hermeticism are around those Egyptian origins and how a priesthood known for their extreme secrecy and even their disdain for non-Egyptian outsiders ultimately came to develop and teach just such a means of salvation couched in the language of those outsiders. That is, what are the origins of what we call Hermeticism as it developed within the Egyptian priesthood, and how or when did the transition of this salvific wisdom from the Egyptian priesthood come to a wider audience into the Greco-Egyptian philosophical idiom? When did all of that take place? And that's a question that I thought, wow, there might be something of an answer, or at least a hint of that answer, in this tomb. Now, this is where this episode of Esoterica is going to be a bit different than normal. I usually try to come to this channel to present the academic consensus as far as possible and editorialize as little as possible. This means actually presenting to you positions that I might not agree with, much less adding my own original research into the conversation. This channel, Esoterica, it's not about me and my opinions. It's about presenting the scholarly consensus as best as I am able, and then empowering all of you, the viewers, to dive into the literature and into the conversation, not for me to hijack the conversation and sneak my own ideas in. I'm basically something of an ambassador for which is often a highly specialized literature to a broader public. This episode is going to be a bit different. From this point forward in the episode, I'm going to be presenting some admittedly preliminary reflections based on some recent research I've done, along with some speculation, to be frank, and all, again, in somewhat schematic fashion. And again, just to be very transparent here, I'm going to be relying on very serious scholarship, but I'm going to be sketching out some more personal thoughts here than I normally ever would in an esoteric episode. But what matters to me here is that I'm going to be transparent with you, the viewer, about how this episode will be different in terms of content. So, from here on out, you can take this as you will. But with that said, one of the more exciting elements of the Egypt trip I did was being able to visit Middle Egypt, an area not as heavily visited as Giza and Saqqara down in Lower Egypt, or Luxor and other sites up in Upper Egypt. But Middle Egypt in Minya Governorate is probably most famous for the site of Tel Amarna, the seat of the power of the so-called heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. Born Amenhotep IV in the mid-14th century BCE, he would dramatically expand the cult of the solar disk, or the Atem, to form a fully henotheistic movement with him and his family, mostly him, at the center, and again, it's most famously expressed in the Hymn to the Aten, which if you've ever taken an Intro to Religion class, you'll be told that the Hymn to the Aten is the first example of monotheism in history. It wasn't, but that's a cool idea. This brief shift would see dramatic changes in art, religious customs, and even ancient geopolitics. However, Akhenaten's death would see the end of the cult and the Aten cult abandoned and everyone associated with it subjected to damnatio memoriae, their names being literally erased from history, along with their faces and basically their memories. However, Middle Egypt was also the center of the ancient cult of Thoth, the lunar god of wisdom, writing, and magic at ancient Khemenu in the Hair Nome. Here remains at least 2 distinct temples dedicated to Thoth, including a megalithic statue of the deity in his baboon form, along with a necropolis featuring the tomb of a family of high priests, plural, of Thoth, at Tun al-Jebel at the gates of the Great Sahara Desert to the west. This tomb, constructed by Petosiris sometime between the transition between the twilight of native Egyptian rule, was intended to house the remains of his father, his older brother, and himself, and eventually his son and probably some other members of his family, having all served as priests of Thoth. Indeed, the coffin of Petosiris survives down to this day in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, richly inlaid with colored glass and precious stones expressing chapter 42 of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, also unfortunately known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Of course, it expresses chapter 42. Everything in ancient Egypt expresses chapter 42 of the Book of the Dead. But the tomb itself is about 6 meters in width and about 7 meters in length, and it's built in the style of an ancient Egyptian temple, and is discovered in a remarkably wonderful state of preservation in the early 20th century. The inner naos is richly decorated with classical Egyptian funerary motifs. The walls to the left are dedicated to Sheshu, the father of Petosiris, and the walls to the right are dedicated to his elder brother, Jed Thoth-Ankh, with 4 pillars featuring the words of Petosiris and his family, along with the 8-meter burial shaft going down into the underground burial chambers. And despite the typical and traditional Egyptian iconography and language, the wall of Sishu already displays some of the idiosyncratic elements of the tomb, with the funerary elements of Sishu being taken in on a cart rather than on a more traditional sledge. Further, the lower panel of the eastern wall of Jed Thoth-Ankh also displays a procession of people bringing offerings which are clearly only semi-Egyptian. Here perhaps we're seeing Persian and Greek artistic influences in the inter-sanctuary of the tomb. But turning to the pronaos, the gateway between the inner tomb and the outside world, the influence of Greek-style art is now especially pronounced. And by pronounced, I mean positively shocking at times. Scenes from the daily lives of craftspeople, carpenters, glassblowers, goldsmiths, agricultural workers, and herdsmen, the process of wine production, but even just Petosiris with his wife enjoying their lives. However, Petosiris and his wife are typically depicted quite Egyptianly. But again, you study these scenes with a close eye and it reveals that they don't look Egyptian at all. There are bearded, muscular men with six-packs crushing grapes. Tunics are draped over bodies. Veils cover women's heads. The headgear is strange. Hairstyles are coiffed. The characters are presented with laurels, and even the physical gestures of the scenes, they're just not Egyptians. Figures front face the viewers. They break the fourth wall and look right at you in a way that you never really see in Egyptian art. These scenes just don't seem Egyptian. They strike the viewer as profoundly Greek. And from an artistic point of view, this combination of very traditional Egyptian elements right alongside very clearly Greek elements is perhaps a tip-off that something truly unusual, even revolutionary, is occurring in the tomb of Petosiris. A fusion of native Egyptian and early Hellenistic religious and artistic elements on the walls of a family of Thoth priests. Specifically, Thoth priests struck me as profoundly conspicuous in light of what I knew would become Hermeticism, famously a fusion of Egyptian religious concepts in the language of Middle Platonic philosophy. And further, what's just as surprising as the appearance of this mixed art style in the tomb is just how early it might actually be. We associate the appearance of Hellenism with the conquest of Alexander the Great, who would famously found the city of Alexandria in 331 BCE. But it appears that Petosiris lived through the Second Achaemenid conquest, then the Alexandrine conquest, and into the subsequent early Ptolemaic rule. Even if Petosiris were designing his tomb in the final years of his life, it would be a remarkably early adoption of Greek influence onto what is one of the most important traditional and conservative Egyptian monuments in their culture, the funerary complex meant to ensure eternal life for those housed inside. And, to boot, this isn't Alexandria, where Hellenism first lands. It's over 500 kilometers to the south via the Nile into the traditional heartland of the Thoth cult among priests who had a reputation for secrecy and a disdain for outside cultures. In fact, a disdain so severe that it survives into the Hermetic literature, into the so-called Hermetic Apocalypse, among other texts, but also a rejection of the Greek language as lacking the essential energeia to properly communicate Hermetic ideas. Again, ironically only preserved in the Greek language. What explains this rather early adoption of Greek artistic elements into an otherwise very conservative Egyptian tomb? While this Greco-Egyptian synthesis in art is certainly interesting, what the interior of Petosiris' tomb says on the walls is also germane to this investigation. First published in the early 1920s, it was immediately obvious that while his tomb contained the standard ancient Egyptian funerary litanies, things found in the Book of the Dead, it was also unusual for the several instances where the texts speak directly to the reader inside of the tomb, urging visitors to the tomb to a life of piety. But first, we learn from the text that Petosiris himself had lived during the period of upheaval during a foreign, probably Persian occupation, in which many traditional Egyptian shrines had been damaged, such that he personally saw to it that those shrines, along with the Thoth shrines, were all repaired, and that he built the tomb for his father and elder brother such that their names should be read aloud and thus they endure through death. His sense of reverence is palpable just from his own autobiography. But at the core of his service, again, was reverence for the divine through service, and the purity of the heart alone were key to him for his ability to find an abode in the Western afterlife. In addition to these autobiographical speeches of Petosiris, we also hear the voice of his father and his elder brother especially, speaking directly to the visitor from the columns which supported this ancient structure. His deceased but presumably immortal father addresses those alive on earth, those who visit this tomb in the deserts, such that we are told that if we are going to be instructed into the proper way of life, it's a technical term in the Egyptian language, this proper way of life is in fact the way of the god, presumably Thoth, and thus the way of Thoth by theological transitivity, I suppose. But it is to live life justly by both people and the divine, filling one's heart with the way of the god. We learn that serving the god is the good way. Blessed is he whose heart lead him to it. And I speak to you of what happened to me. I let you perceive the plan of God. I will let you discern knowledge of his might. Thus, we even learn that through learning of this way of God, we may access the very mind of the divine and learn the very will of God. Again, presumably Thoth. Indeed, this just way of life causes others to praise the god and allows one serenity upon contemplating death, such that one, quote, praises God for him who loves God. He will reach his tomb without grief. Jed Thoth Ach, the elder brother of Petosiris, must have himself been a pretty jovial fellow. We hear him urge us on to the proper way of life, such that we should praise the god on behalf of his wisdom, and then we're immediately told that we should drink till drunk while enjoying the feast day, because nothing material can be taken to the world beyond, and death will accept no bribe. Indeed, to serve the gods and one's fellow man in joy, and given that the God alone provides for the righteous, one just frankly need not worry about accommodations in the afterlife if one has correctly followed this proper way of life. This seems to be in somewhat stark contrast to, well, Egyptian tombs are otherwise packed with things for the afterlife. Finally, we also hear from Petosiris' son, Thoth, who sadly seems to have actually died at a young age. We are told to pronounce my name with abundant libation. Thoth will favor you for it, such that if we praise the Ka, the soul of this perhaps deceased child, that Thoth will bless one with a long and pious life. And added to this litany are the voices of several of Petosiris' children, such that walking in the way of the god, specifically in the way of Thoth, is simply beautiful, and that Petosiris has been rewarded by the twice great god. Yes, twice great here in the Tomb of Petosiris. Sometimes Thoth is twice, thrice, 5 times, even 8 times great in Egyptian literature. In fact, I even misread these hieroglyphic sequences when I was in the tomb the first time, after it took me the better part of about 15 minutes looking for them. You know, my Egyptian's not that great, but it was only because of my admittedly very meager ability to read some Egyptian that this all first tipped me off that these didactic sections, these dialogical sections on the columns of these tombs, otherwise, I think I would have probably just assumed that I was surrounded by the usual litanies of funerary incantations that you find in typical Egyptian tombs. But that also led me into a complete deep dive studying this tomb when I was supposed to be resting during my 2 days off between the 2 tour seminars. These are particularly scholar problems. We get an idea in the steel trap of our mind, and we just can't let go. But the point I want to make about these speeches by the family of Petosiris is that they seem to interpolate their reader or hearer, and of course they are in hieroglyphics and would have required some specialization, probably a priest to have read them to anyone, but they interpolate you into a dialogue about the correct way of life, or the way of the god, or the way of Thoth, centering around enjoying, but not being overly attached to this world, moral behavior to other people, including both the living and the passed on, and especially reverence and service to the god, or gods, which seems to allow one to die without fear, but it also seems to give one access to the mind or the will of the divine, at least in some sense. Thus, these passages on the walls of the tomb make for a kind of dialogical teaching form whereby the reader is interpolated into a conversation about the proper way of living as the way of God, specifically the way of the twice great Thoth. This is especially interesting when set into the context of the 2nd century BCE Ostrogard archive of Hor, found at the catacombs of animals sacred to Thoth at Saqqara. There, several documents, especially 16, 17, and 23, written by the scribe Hor either for himself or for someone else. But we hear of the petitioner, or of Hor, himself having spent time in the temple of Thoth contemplating the path of Thoth, a slightly different term in the Egyptian, but pretty similar, such that they apparently had a vision from the god in a dream and perhaps even received an oracle. Specifically, it seems that Hor is petitioning Thoth after having been wronged by some officials, he calls them mighty men, perhaps local priests, such that Thoth will bring down calamity upon them for this injustice done to him. Hor even denounces them as those who have abandoned the way. Indeed, he seems to believe that being on the way of Thoth is itself a kind of magical protection against those who would act unjustly against him. From the Petosiris tomb and the Hor archive, we seem to have a shared language, the way or the path of the god, or the way or the path of Thoth, both linked with cultic centers associated with the deity and tied in some sense to an idea that reverence and moral justice are at the apex of what it means to serve the god. Further, adherents of this way seem to have access to the deity through revelations after correctly following this way, and perhaps through dream oracles revealed while sleeping in specific ritual contexts. Thus, we seem to have a way or a path of Thoth in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, detailed in the funerary hieroglyphics in the Petosiris tomb and in the demotic context that may have had some initiatory elements, at least in the sense that you can be claimed to be not on the path of Thoth as Hor derides his persecutors. So, are we looking at an initiatory path of Thoth, an initiatory way of the god, a way of Thoth already in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE? Maybe. But who is this path of Thoth for? That is, who could be on this path at all at this period? Clearly, both Petosiris and Hor seem to be mostly in a priestly orbit and operating perhaps in a specifically ritual context. But we may be witness to a shift toward a broader audience for the way of Thoth if we turn our attention back to the Tomb of Petosiris. There, in the decades after its construction, we see Greek graffiti begin to appear, especially in the outer pronaos part of the tomb. Now, some of this graffiti is just typical chaire, like, what's up, hello, or just a series of names, such as the 6 slaves of Mithronos. However, another is much more fascinating. It reads in the form of a poetic invocation. I invoke Petosiris, whose corpse is underground, whose soul resides in the abode of the gods. Wise, he is reunited to wise men. A subsequent graffiti near this inscription reveals that the invocation text actually might be a kind of cipher, a type of Greek gematria where the words are adding up to a very particular kind of meaning. The site of the tomb seems to have become a pilgrimage during the Ptolemaic period, with Greek-speaking people recognizing Petosiris as a sophos, a wise person. Indeed, a sage worthy of invocation decades after his death. Now, we can't know what exactly the cultural, religious, or spiritual exchanges around the tomb of Petosiris look like, or to what degree they even occurred. Again, I told you I'm going to be doing a bit of speculation here, but it seems that during the high point of Hellenism, during the Ptolemaic period, the time that saw the rise of the Library of Alexandria, Hermopolis Magna, the center of the Thoth cult, at the temple tomb of a renowned family of Thoth priests represented by Petosiris, Greek-speaking pilgrims were making their way to the edge of the western desert to pay their respects and invoke that wise soul. Indeed, the region around the tomb of Petosiris would feature a massive system of catacombs for housing offerings, specifically mummified ibises and baboons, both, of course, sacred to Thoth. Graeco-Roman tombs would come to dot the site, including the famous tomb of Isidora, a young woman who allegedly drowned and whose mummy is still on display right next to the tomb of Petosiris to this day. Nearby, a tomb of Thoth operated, and a sacred pilgrimage route that ran right near the tomb of Petosiris. But by the latter Roman period, the tomb was increasingly used for secondary burials. The pronaos would be filled nearly 9 meters high with coffins before a new plaster vault was constructed within the original pillared entrance, and that secondary door would be filled with mud-fired bricks and eventually itself plastered over before the sands of the Sahara would slowly encroach upon the site, eventually swallowing up the tomb of Petosiris and everything else in the vicinity for nearly 2,000 years. But before the sands entombed the region in darkness, it preserved precisely the kind of place we'd reasonably imagine as ground zero for the development of what would become Hermeticism. The teaching tomb of a high priest of Thoth decorated with Greek artistic elements, declaring the spiritual benefits of following the way of Thoth, the way of life, the way of the god, among Egyptian and Greek and Roman cultural elements marked by Greek-speaking pilgrimages hoping to gain wisdom from the spirit of the Sophos, the long-dead Petosiris. This just seems like the kind of place where Hermeticism would have been born and flourished. But a few Greek graffiti aren't the final vestiges of how the wisdom of Petosiris would endure through the centuries after his death. Starting around the turn of the Common Era, perhaps just as the Sahara was slowly beginning to encroach upon his tomb, a character bearing that exact name, Petosiris, along with the wise king, Nechepso, or just Necho the Wise, they become increasingly stock characters in a range of primarily Hellenistic astrological literature. Over 100 Demotic and Greek references to them can be found in that surviving literature down to this day, and that's just what survived. Now, the first question is whether or not the Petosiris of these texts can be identified with the historical Petosiris buried there in Hermopolis. Well, the data here is simply inconclusive. There were many Petosirises apparently living at that time. But given his position as High Priest of Thoth, a god deeply associated with just such kind of astrological lore, his tomb being a site of Ptolemaic pilgrimage, and thought of as a sage worthy of invocation by at least some of those Greek-speaking pilgrims, contends at least reasonably to my mind for an identity between the two, at least in the minds of the authors of those texts. Now, it doesn't so much matter if the historical Petosiris himself even composed those astrological treatises or any astrological treatise. Of course, it'd be interesting if he did, but rather what matters is that a range of Hellenistic astrologers seem to have wanted to associate him with those writings. And of course, such pseudepigrapha is just a commonplace in esoteric lore generally, and in Hermetic lore specifically. And just to put a finer point on it, frankly, I don't think that of all the names they could have picked for a stock character of the most profound astrological lore in their culture, that they simply picked Petosiris out of a hat. Now, could have the historical Petosiris have written astrological literature? Well, clearly there was a substantial amount of varied indigenous astrological literature that made a very strong impression on Greek-speaking astrologers. Indeed, the Greek speakers really looked to the Egyptians as their forebears in this field, and the literature treats both Petosiris and Hatshepsut as, well, with extreme deference bordering on worship. In fact, we have Petosiris recovering ancient texts in some of the Demotic literature by Imhotep, listed right alongside Hermes, Abraham, Asclepius, Orpheus, and the regular guest stars of Dancing with the Prisca Theologia. Indeed, it's as if Hermes Trismegistus was the sagely father of all wisdom generally, with Petosiris in this literature specializing in the occult science of astrology, especially the study of fate. Now, this is of course crucial, it's important for Hermeticism, as the escape from the body trapped in fate is key to salvation more generally. Thus, understanding the forces of fate as expressed through astral power would become central to the actual practices of Hermeticism. I think this is why astrology and Hermeticism are so intimately linked in the ancient world. But in the over 100 fragments that mention Petosiris, we're told of his invention, mastery, and teaching on topics as variegated as eclipses, comets, basics and advanced manuals of astrology, origin of the world, which, by the way, was said to have begun at Hermopolis, at least according to some Egyptian traditions, the traditionally Egyptian topic of the deacons, lots of fortune, natal astrology, predictions for the length of one's life, various elections for good and bad months, the best periods for the conception of children, medical astrology, including the use of plants for inducing consciousness-altering states, and numerological predictions. In other words, someone had to have written these Egyptian astrological documents, and a high priest of Thoth with access to the archives in the houses of life, the Egyptian temples, would just be a prime candidate for the kind of people who would have written this kind of literature. So if not Petosiris, then certainly someone very much like him would have been responsible for just these Egyptian astrological compositions. And of those numerological compositions that I just mentioned, some are absolute standouts, especially those numerological methods which generated several systems of prediction techniques invoking taking the value of someone's name in Greek, adding to it a specific value for a given lunar month, and then a third value for when in the lunar month that prediction falls, distributed through the month, and then taking that number and dividing it by 29 or 30, and then that value, a number between 1 and 29, is then plotted on a design known as Petosiris' circle, which will indicate the predicted outcome for weal and for woe. Now, several versions of this technique are known. Some of them are quite complex, with several means of generating the numbers and the varying complexity of the predictive geometric device. Again, they're known as Petosiris' circle. Just how old these techniques are isn't clear, but the Greek manuscripts that describe them date back to at least around 1000 BCE, if not just a little before, and the circles appear even early in Western Europe. A fascinating survival of the potential wisdom of Petosiris into the European numerological and divinatory context. Finally, while Petosiris isn't much associated with magic in the literature, we do get an interesting reference to him in the anti-Gnostic tract Against All Heresies that, quote, the right hand power of fire has influence upon crops. It was called men by ignorance. According to its likeness were born Bumegas, Astanes, the thrice great Hermes, Curites, Petosiris, Zodarion, Berosus, Astramsicus, and Zoroastrius. So he's just sort of thrown in there with the who's who of, ancient primordial wisdom. Thus, in over 100 disparate texts associated with astrology, numerology, and to a much lesser degree magic, Petosiris is given pride of place right alongside Hermes Trismegistus and is linked with one of the most core Hermetic sciences, with astrology. And again, I just don't think this is a coincidence. To my mind, what we have here is a quasi-historical memory linking an actual high priest of Thoth with the emergent philosophy and practice of Hermeticism and one of the most practical wings of that soteriology, astrology. I suppose the case that I'm putting together here is that both the historical and the literary Petosiris are an overlooked yet important part of the puzzle that is the very earliest history of Hermeticism. I would suggest that the Tomb of Petosiris, its surrounding Graeco-Roman developments, its dialogical, didactic inscriptions, along with the archive at Hor, and the Petosiris of ancient astrological lore should all be considered as one part and parcel of the story for the development and perhaps even the origins of Hermeticism itself. Indeed, the tomb inscriptions may be, and should be, I think, considered something like proto-Hermetic texts, in that moral, reverent living are considered to be the way of the god Thoth, which provides access to the mind and the will of the deity, tropes very much present in later Hermetic texts. Now, is this link that I'm making conclusive? No, it's definitely not conclusive. I'll again admit I'm speculating to some degree, and I'm very much aware of that. I'll also admit this investigation is very much in its preliminary phases. But given the cumulative case that I've made in this episode, I think the role of Petosiris in the early history of Hermeticism cannot and it should not be ignored. As always, I'm going to put links to all the resources that I've used to build up this case as much as it is in the description and in the pinned comment. And I'm going to continue this line of inquiry because I think it matters and I think it's on to something. Again, my apologies for a bit of a departure from a usual episode of Esoterica. Again, this is my work and sorry to burden you with it. But I hope this episode has opened up a new avenue of research on a topic close to the hearts and spirits of many that watch. Frankly, including me. Until soon, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.